apologies for the kind of rough appearance, but we had a bit of a time rush here. Anyways, thank you so much. The Foreign Minister sends her regards to all of you. As you may know, the British Foreign Secretary is visiting today, and she is still in meetings with him and her Nordic colleagues. However, I am very happy to be here, especially since IATA has a special place in my heart. It has been almost a decade since I first discovered this kind of network of security policy geeks, and I was elected to the board just 4 floors above where I stand now. I'm also very happy to talk to you directly after my former boss, the Minister of Defense. He provided an excellent overview of the historic development of the Arab Spring, how it affected Western security, and how NATO responded, the backdrop for many of the regional developments that we live through today. I'd like to follow up on his remarks by touching briefly upon the current situation and some of the more recent trends. The Foreign Minister often reminds me of something she said during a trip to the region at the time of the Arab Spring. We've seen dictatorships fall, but with few exceptions, we've rarely seen democracies rise. And unfortunately, the Arab Spring quickly turned to winter. 10 years after the Arab Spring, there is still widespread unrest, underdevelopment and conflict in the region. It is often described as an arc of instability from Morocco in the west to the Gulf in the east. Many of the states are fragile, political governance is often autocratic, shaky, or both, and human rights are under pressure. Over time, there have been many similarities across the region, and many still remain, but when the Arab Spring rose, it rose for different reasons in different cultural and political contexts, and it took different turns in the various countries. Given the time constraints, let me focus on 3 countries where developments in 2011 really grabbed the world's attention and where what happened since did not turn out as we hoped. First, Syria. This week, we mark 10 long years of conflict in Syria. The war has caused immense suffering and widespread devastation. More than 5 million Syrians are refugees, over 6 million internally displaced. And an entire generation is growing up with no or limited access to education and knowing only conflict. The humanitarian situation is severe. For almost as long as the conflict has lasted, there has been a stalemate in the UN Security Council, caused by the veto powers who've put a stop to more or less any progress that could have been made. This has resulted in the situation deteriorating even further. In addition to lack of any political progress, gaining humanitarian access and providing aid is a major challenge. We're down from 2 to only 1 humanitarian access point in northwest Syria, where humanitarian aid gets through to the civilian population. Norway has taken a leading role in the UN Security Council, as we, together with Ireland, are penholders for the resolution on humanitarian access, working to ensure that the one border crossing at least remains open. Syria also remains by far the largest recipient of Norwegian humanitarian funds, regrettably with good reason. Libya has been another dark chapter in the decade since 2011. After the fall of Gaddafi, the country basically fragmented into warring clans and militias and has served as a battlefield by proxy for both regional actors and outside powers. The country has served as a major source of instability in the region for years, with the consequences also being felt in Europe in the form of major migration flows. Recent developments, however, gives us a slight hope of optimism. The ceasefire from October 23rd last year is still holding, and it was an important step for Libya when the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum elected an interim government, which was approved by the House of Representatives just yesterday. We are hopeful that it can provide much needed unity and stability before the upcoming elections in December. The final country that I would like to highlight is Egypt. The images from Tahrir Square were perhaps the most iconic of all that came out of the Arab Spring. The Mubarak regime was ousted and elections called, only for political reform and change to whittle away during a short interim rule by the Muslim Brotherhood, followed by a full-scale comeback by the military. Egypt remains a regional powerhouse with a strong hunger for stability and economic development, and focusing on infrastructure and welfare, while civilian and political rights are falling increasingly further behind. Human rights are under increased pressure. Social media and other platforms are under surveillance. Freedom of speech is practically non-existent. And the generations of Egyptians that went out in the streets in 2011 have almost disappeared from public view. This leads me to the current situation, because in many ways, the Arab Spring was based on socio-economic factors. People urged for better quality of life, safe jobs, and good governance. Very little of that has been delivered, meaning that frustration, anger, and lack of optimism is still strongly felt amongst the people, in particular amongst the younger population. Another factor that affects the younger generation in particular is the unemployment rate. This window of opportunity has huge potential for increased trade and interaction between peoples and cultures. However, violent conflicts continue to be an impediment to regional stability, and we've seen that major players like China, Turkey, Iran, and Russia are increasingly trying to fill the space that the US left open when choosing a more remote approach to the region. China has within short time become a leading trading partner to many of the countries in the region. Russia keeps positioning strategically in many of the conflicts, with ambitions of strengthening the position even further. In the case of the presence in Syria, this has strategic implications throughout the whole Mediterranean. The geopolitical changes that we are witnessing in the Middle East are likely to increase in the years to come. There is a different dynamic. Still, several unanswered questions remain. We have yet to see how Iran will act as the normalization agreements are put into practice. It is unlikely that there will be a solution to the conflict in Yemen anytime soon. We're still far from knowing how the conflict in Syria will end and what kind of political solution will be achieved. At the same time, the Biden administration are still settling in. So far, their focus is domestic. But could they return to having a stronger presence in the region? And if so, when? In the meantime, who will continue to fill the space left vacant by the US? All of this will affect the regional development in one way or another. And while strengthened regional stability could be within reach, it is difficult to make any certain predicaments. What remains certain is that either way the region will evolve, it will have consequences way beyond the region itself. This is, of course, just a brief overview. I know that you will learn much more about this in the upcoming days, and I'm confident that you will have inspiring and educational days. I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference. Thank you.